Before I tell you this story that's been haunting my dreams for the past 4 months, I gotta ask you something that'll make you think twice about every stranger you pass by. Have you ever wondered what secrets the people around you are carrying? What stories are hidden behind tired eyes and weathered faces? What dark chapters from the past are buried so deep that even family members don't know about them? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because after you hear what happened to me on that bone-chilling February night near Flagstaff, you'll never look at an elderly person the same way again. My name's Jake Morrison. Been running these highways for 22 years now. Started when I was 23, fresh out of a messy divorce, looking for a way to escape my problems and make an honest living. Hauled everything from fresh produce to heavy machinery across this beautiful country. Seen sunrises over the Rockies that would make you weep, and sunsets across the desert that paint the sky in colors you didn't know existed. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for the mystery I stumbled upon during what started as just another routine run. It was February 18th, and I was pushing my Peterbilt 379 westbound on Route 66, carrying a load of auto parts from Detroit to Phoenix. You know that stretch of highway between Williams and Flagstaff? Beautiful country on a clear day, but when the weather turns nasty, it becomes one of the most unforgiving pieces of road in America. The weather forecast had been calling for light snow, maybe an inch or two, but Mother Nature had other plans that night. By the time I hit the Arizona state line, the sky had turned into this angry gray blanket that stretched from horizon to horizon, and snowflakes the size of quarters were smacking against my windshield like frozen bullets. Now I've driven through blizzards in Montana that buried cars completely, and ice storms in Pennsylvania that turned highways into skating rinks, but there was something different about this storm. Something that made my gut twist with unease, like when you know something bad is about to happen but you can't put your finger on what. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees, and the wind was howling like a banshee across the desert landscape, creating these eerie whistling sounds that seemed to follow my truck down the highway. Most sensible drivers would have pulled over at the first truck stop, grabbed some hot coffee, maybe caught a few hours of sleep until the storm passed. Hell, that's what I should have done. But I had a tight delivery schedule, and my dispatcher, this hard-nosed woman named Carol who'd been riding drivers for 30 years, had been breathing down my neck all week about on-time deliveries. "Jake," she'd said during our last phone call, "this customer is threatening to pull their contract if we have any more delays. I need you to make this delivery happen, no matter what." So there I was, making the decision that would change everything. Instead of stopping in Flagstaff like every fiber of common sense was telling me to do, I decided to push through. Just another 100 miles, I told myself, gripping the steering wheel tighter as the snow started coming down harder. The highway was getting slick, that dangerous kind of slick where you can't tell if it's just wet pavement or black ice waiting to send you spinning into the guardrail. Visibility was dropping fast, and I had to slow down to about 40 miles per hour just to see the road markings. My CB radio was crackling with warnings from other drivers about jackknifed semis and cars sliding off the road. "Breaker 19, this is Desert Fox heading eastbound," came a voice through the static, sounding stressed and tired. "Got a real mess brewing out here, drivers. Multiple accidents between mile markers 185 and 195. Recommend finding shelter ASAP before this gets any worse." I keyed the mic and responded, "Copy that, Desert Fox. This is Big Jake westbound. How's it looking past mile marker 190? I'm trying to make Phoenix before morning." "Ugly as sin, Big Jake. Snow's coming down sideways and the wind's gusting something fierce. Saw 3 cars in the ditch in the last 5 miles. Be safe out there, driver. Ain't no load worth dying for." I should have listened. Should have turned around right then and headed back to that warm truck stop with its bright lights, hot coffee, and friendly waitresses who'd seen every kind of weather and every kind of driver. But you know how it is when you're trying to make a living on the road, when you've got bills to pay and a reputation to maintain. Sometimes you make choices that seem reasonable at the time, but turn out to be anything but reasonable. That's when I saw him. At first I thought it was just a pile of old blankets or maybe some trash that had blown off a truck and gotten caught against the concrete barrier. You see all kinds of debris on the highway, especially during storms like this one. Cardboard boxes, tarps, even furniture that wasn't properly secured. But as my headlights swept across the scene, cutting through the swirling snow like searchlights in a war movie, I realized it was a person, an elderly man, curled up in a fetal position against that cold concrete barrier on the side of the highway, completely covered in snow like some kind of human snowdrift. in the middle of absolutely nowhere, in 15-degree weather, with a blizzard raging around him that could kill a healthy young person in a matter of hours. I hit the brakes so hard my load shifted, and I could feel the trailer wanting to jackknife behind me. The whole rig shuddered as the air brakes hissed, and for a moment I thought I was going to lose control completely. My heart was pounding like a jackhammer as I managed to pull over onto the shoulder, hazard lights flashing like emergency beacons, trying to process what I was seeing through the chaos of the storm. The snow was coming down so hard I could barely make out his form, but there was no mistaking it now. This was a real person, and from the way he wasn't moving, wasn't responding to the sound of my truck or the bright lights, I wasn't even sure if he was still alive. Jesus Christ, I muttered, grabbing my heavy coat and the powerful flashlight I keep for roadside emergencies from behind the seat. The wind hit me like a physical blow when I opened the door, and the cold was so intense, it felt like thousands of needles stabbing into every exposed inch of my face and hands. I had to lean into the wind just to walk the 30 feet to where he was lying, each step a battle against the storm that seemed determined to push me back to the safety of my warm cab. The snow crunched under my boots with that particular sound it makes when it's really cold, and I could hear my own breathing heavy and panicked, mixing with the constant howl of the wind. When I got close enough to shine my flashlight on him, my blood ran cold for reasons I couldn't quite explain. This wasn't some homeless drifter or hitchhiker who'd gotten caught in the storm and was trying to wait it out. This was a well-dressed elderly man, maybe mid-70s, wearing what looked like an expensive wool coat that was now soaked through and frozen stiff as a board. His hair was silver white, perfectly styled even in his unconscious state, and even lying there half-frozen against that concrete barrier, there was something distinguished about his face. Something that spoke of a life lived with purpose, maybe even importance. The kind of face you might see in a boardroom or a country club, not abandoned on the side of a highway in the middle of a blizzard. But here's what really got to me. What made my hands shake as I knelt down beside him in the snow, clutched in his right hand so tight that his knuckles were white, even through the cold and the poor circulation, was a small leather briefcase. Not a wallet, not a bag of personal belongings, but a genuine leather briefcase, the expensive kind with brass corners and a combination lock. And sticking out of his coat pocket was what looked like the corner of an old photograph, the kind with those white borders they used to have back in the 60s and 70s before everything went digital. Even in his unconscious state, even with hypothermia setting in, this man was holding on to these items like his life depended on them. I checked for a pulse, my fingers clumsy with cold and adrenaline, pressing against his neck where I could feel the faint flutter of life still fighting against the storm. It was there, weak but steady, and I could see his chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths that created small puffs of vapor in the freezing air. He was alive, but barely. Hypothermia was definitely setting in, and if I didn't get him warm soon, he wasn't going to make it through the night. But as I started to lift him, something strange happened that I'll never forget. Even unconscious, even half-frozen and barely clinging to life, his grip on that briefcase tightened, like whatever was inside was more important to him than his own survival. "Come on, old-timer," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reassuring even though my heart was racing and my mind was spinning with questions. "Let's get you out of this storm before we both freeze to death out here." I managed to get him up, supporting his weight against my shoulder, and half-carried, half-dragged him through the snow to my truck. Getting him up into the cab was like trying to move a frozen statue, his body rigid with cold. But adrenaline is a hell of a thing when someone's life is on the line. I cranked the heat up as high as it would go and grabbed every blanket I had in my sleeper berth, wrapping him up like a cocoon. That's when I got my first real look at him in the light of the cab. And what I saw raised even more questions. This wasn't just any elderly man who'd gotten lost in the storm. His clothes, even soaked and frozen, were clearly expensive. Custom-tailored, I'd guess. His shoes were Italian leather, the kind that cost more than most people make in a week. His watch, barely visible under his coat sleeve, looked like a genuine Rolex Submariner. But it was his face that really caught my attention and made me wonder who the hell this guy really was. Even unconscious, there was something about his features that seemed familiar, like I'd seen him before somewhere, maybe in a newspaper or on television. And that briefcase. Even as I was wrapping him in blankets, trying to get his core body temperature up and watching for signs of consciousness, he wouldn't let go of it. I tried gently prying his fingers loose, thinking maybe I could find some identification inside, a driver's license or business card that would tell me who he was and how to contact his family. but his grip was like a vice, like those fingers had been welded to that handle. Whatever was in there, it meant everything to him, more than his own life, apparently. As the warmth from the heater started to bring some color back to his pale, almost blue-tinged face, I noticed something else that made my trucker instincts start tingling. On his left hand, barely visible under a thin gold wedding band that looked like it had been worn for decades, was a scar. Not just any scar, but the kind of precise surgical scar you get from serious medical work, the kind that comes from reconstructive surgery after a bad accident. And on his right temple, almost completely hidden by his silver hair, was another small scar, the kind pilots sometimes get from wearing headsets for thousands of hours, the metal rubbing against the same spot over and over again during long flights. That's when it hit me like a freight train. This man wasn't just some wealthy retiree who'd gotten lost in the storm and wandered away from his car. There was something about him, something in the way he carried himself even unconscious, something in those expensive clothes and that death grip on the briefcase that spoke of a life lived on the edge, a life with secrets, big secrets, the kind that might explain why a well-dressed 76-year-old man would be found half frozen on the side of Route 66 in the middle of a blizzard, clutching a briefcase like it contained the secrets of the universe. I grabbed my CB radio and keyed the mic. Breaker 19, this is Big Jake at mile marker 188 westbound. I've got an elderly gentleman here who was nearly frozen to death on the roadside. He's alive but needs medical attention. Anyone know if there's an ambulance or medical facility nearby? The radio crackled with static for a moment before a voice came through. Big Jake, this is Smokey Bear. There's a small medical clinic in Flagstaff, but with this storm, I doubt any ambulance is getting through tonight. You might have to wait it out until morning or try to get him there yourself. I looked down at the old man, still unconscious but breathing more steadily now. His face was starting to look more human and less like a frozen corpse, but there was still something deeply unsettling about the whole situation. Who was he? How did he end up out there? And why was he holding onto that briefcase like it contained his entire life story? That's when I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of waiting for help that might not come, I decided to try to make it to that clinic in Flagstaff. It was only about 15 miles, but in these conditions it might as well have been 100. I secured him as best I could in the passenger seat, making sure he was wrapped tight in blankets, and started the slow, dangerous journey through the storm. The visibility was so bad I could barely see 10 feet in front of the truck, and the road was getting more treacherous by the minute. About halfway there, something incredible happened. The old man's eyes fluttered open, not fully conscious but aware enough to look around with confusion, and what I can only describe as fear. Real, deep fear. His first instinct wasn't to ask where he was or thank me for helping him. His first instinct was to check that briefcase, to make sure it was still there, still secure in his grip. When he saw it was, I watched some of the tension leave his shoulders. Where? He started to say, his voice barely a whisper, hoarse from the cold and whatever ordeal had brought him to that roadside. Where am I? You're safe, I told him, keeping my eyes on the road but glancing over to make sure he was okay. I'm Jake Morrison. Found you half frozen on Route 66. We're heading to a medical clinic in Flagstaff. You're going to be fine, but I need to know your name. Do you have any family I should call? He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him studying me in the dim light of the dashboard, like he was trying to decide whether he could trust me. Finally, he spoke, and what he said sent chills down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold outside. My name is Michael Benson, he said slowly, carefully, like he was testing each word before he said it. And if you found me on that road tonight, it means they're getting close. Closer than I thought they could get. He paused, looking out at the storm raging around us, then back at that briefcase. I've been running for 43 years, son. 43 years, and I thought I'd finally found a place where the past couldn't catch up with me. But I was wrong. I felt my hands tighten on the steering wheel. Running from who? What are you talking about? Michael Benson looked at me with eyes that held decades of secrets, decades of fear, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Tell me, Jake, he said, his voice getting stronger as the warmth brought him back to full consciousness. What do you know about aviation in the 1970s? About pilots who flew routes that weren't supposed to exist, carrying cargo that was never supposed to be documented? The question hit me like a punch to the gut, and I nearly swerved off the road. Aviation in the 1970s? Undocumented flights? This was getting into territory that made my skin crawl. The kind of stuff you hear whispered about in truck stops late at night when drivers have had too much coffee and start talking about conspiracy theories. But looking at this man, at the genuine fear in his eyes and the way he was clutching that briefcase, I knew this wasn't some paranoid delusion. This was real. I don't know much about aviation, I admitted, fighting to keep the truck steady as a gust of wind tried to push us into the guardrail. But I've heard stories, rumors about pilots who flew for people they weren't supposed to fly for, carrying things they weren't supposed to carry, black ops stuff, CIA operations that never officially happened. Michael nodded slowly, like I'd just confirmed something he'd been hoping I wouldn't know. Smart man. Most people prefer to believe those stories are just fiction, just Hollywood nonsense. Makes it easier to sleep at night. He shifted in his seat, wincing as feeling started to return to his extremities. I was one of those pilots, Jake. For 12 years from 1968 to 1980, I flew missions that don't exist in any official record. Missions that took me to places that aren't on any map, carrying cargo that could start wars or end them. The storm seemed to intensify around us like nature itself was trying to prevent this conversation from happening. I had to slow down to barely 20 miles per hour, the windshield wipers working overtime to clear the snow that was coming down in sheets now. What kind of cargo? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. Weapons, documents? Sometimes people who needed to disappear or reappear somewhere else entirely. His voice was getting steadier, but there was a tremor in it that spoke of old trauma, old guilt. I told myself I was serving my country, that what I was doing was necessary for national security, and maybe some of it was. But toward the end, I started to realize that some of my flights weren't for the government at all. They were for private interests, powerful people who used government resources for their own purposes. I felt my mouth go dry. What happened in 1980? Why did you stop? Michael was quiet for so long I thought maybe he'd passed out again. But then he spoke, and his voice was barely audible over the sound of the storm. I saw something I wasn't supposed to see, learned something that certain people would kill to keep secret. So I made a choice. I took something that didn't belong to me, something that could expose everything, and I disappeared. He held up the briefcase, and in the dim light of the dashboard I could see his knuckles were white again. This briefcase contains evidence of operations that violated every international law you can think of. Arms deals with dictators, drug money laundering, assassinations disguised as accidents. 43 years I've been carrying this burden, moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. But why now? I asked, my voice barely steady as the implications of what he was telling me started to sink in. Why were you out there in the storm? What happened? Michael's laugh was bitter, the sound of a man who'd seen too much and lived with too many secrets for too long. 3 days ago, I got a phone call at the little apartment I'd been renting in Flagstaff, a voice I hadn't heard in over 4 decades, but one I recognized immediately. My old handler, a man named Colonel Harrison, who was supposed to have died in a car accident in 1982. Except he wasn't dead, Jake. He was very much alive, and he'd found me. The truck hit a patch of ice, and I felt the trailer start to slide. I managed to correct it, but my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it over the engine noise. What did he want? The briefcase, the evidence. He told me I had 24 hours to bring it to a location outside of town, or they'd come for me. And when they came, it wouldn't be quick or painless. Michael's grip on the briefcase tightened even more. I've spent 43 years knowing this day would come, but I thought I'd be ready for it. I thought I'd figured out a way to expose everything without getting myself killed in the process. So what's your plan? I asked, though I was starting to wonder if I really wanted to be involved in whatever this was. This was way beyond helping a stranded motorist. This was life and death stuff, the kind that gets innocent people disappeared. I was trying to get to Phoenix, he said. I have a contact there, a journalist who's been investigating government corruption for decades, someone I trust to get this information to the right people. But my car broke down about 10 miles outside of Flagstaff, and with the storm coming in, I knew I wouldn't make it on foot. I was trying to find shelter when the hypothermia started setting in. I could see the lights of Flagstaff starting to appear through the storm, dim and hazy but getting closer. And you think these people, this Colonel Harrison, they're still looking for you? Michael turned to look at me, and in his eyes, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Jake, they're not just looking for me. By now they know someone picked me up. They'll have people watching every hospital, Every clinic, every place I might go for help. And that means they'll be looking for you too. The words hit me like a physical blow. What are you saying? I'm saying that by helping me, you've just painted a target on your back. These aren't the kind of people who leave loose ends. They can't afford to let anyone who might have seen that briefcase or heard my story just walk away. He paused, studying my face in the dashboard light. I'm sorry, Jake. I never wanted to drag an innocent person into this. But now that you're involved, we need to figure out how to keep both of us alive long enough to get this information to someone who can use it. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel now, and it wasn't from the cold. The reality of what Michael was telling me was starting to sink in, and I felt like I was drowning in quicksand. One minute I was just a trucker trying to help a stranded old man, and the next I was apparently involved in some decades-old government conspiracy that could get me killed. Jesus Christ, Michael, what have you gotten me into? I know how this sounds, he said, his voice urgent now as we approached the outskirts of Flagstaff. I know it sounds like the ravings of a paranoid old man. But Jake, I need you to listen to me very carefully. We cannot go to that medical clinic. We cannot go anywhere official. The moment we show up at a hospital or police station, they'll know exactly where we are. I wanted to argue with him, wanted to tell him he was crazy, and that I was going to drop him off at the emergency room and wash my hands of this whole situation. But something in his voice, something in the way he was looking at me, made me believe him. This wasn't paranoia. This was a man who'd spent 43 years staying one step ahead of people who wanted him dead, and he'd survived this long by trusting his instincts. So, what do we do? I asked, pulling into a 24-hour truck stop on the edge of town. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a few other big rigs whose drivers had decided to wait out the storm. We can't just drive around all night in this weather. Michael was scanning the parking lot like a hawk, his eyes moving from truck to truck looking for anything that seemed out of place. There's a motel about 2 miles from here, the Desert Rose Inn. It's the kind of place that takes cash and doesn't ask too many questions. We can hole up there for the night, and in the morning we'll figure out how to get to Phoenix. And you think your journalist friend can actually help? Can actually do something with whatever's in that briefcase? Her name is Sarah Chen, and she's been investigating government corruption for the Washington Herald for 20 years. She's the one person I trust to handle this information responsibly, to make sure it gets to the right people without getting us both killed in the process. He paused, looking down at the briefcase. But first, I need to show you something. Something that will help you understand why this is so important, why I've been carrying this burden for so long. He started working the combination lock on the briefcase, his fingers moving with practiced precision, despite the cold and the stress. What I'm about to show you, Jake, it's going to change how you see everything. Your government, your country, maybe even yourself. Are you sure you want to know? I thought about it for a long moment, watching the snow continue to fall outside the truck windows. Part of me wanted to say no, wanted to tell him to take his secrets and his briefcase and find someone else to help him. But another part of me, the part that had always been curious about the world beyond the highway, needed to know. Show me. The briefcase opened with a soft click, and even in the dim light of the truck cab, I could see it was packed with documents, photographs, and what looked like audio cassette tapes. Michael pulled out a manila folder and opened it carefully, like he was handling something that might explode. This, he said, showing me a black and white photograph, is a picture of me in 1975. Standing next to a plane that officially never existed. The photograph showed a much younger Michael Benson in a pilot's uniform, standing beside what looked like a modified cargo plane. But it wasn't the plane that caught my attention. It was the man standing next to Michael, a tall figure in a military uniform whose face had been partially obscured by shadows. Who's that with you? Colonel Harrison, my handler, the man who was supposed to have died in 1982 but called me 3 days ago. Michael's voice was grim as he pulled out another photograph. And this is what we were loading onto that plane. The second photograph made my stomach turn. It showed wooden crates being loaded into the cargo hold, and stenciled on the side of each crate were symbols I recognized from history books. Weapons, military-grade weapons. Where were you taking those? Central America. We were arming rebel groups that the U.S. government publicly condemned but privately supported. This particular shipment was going to a group in Nicaragua that would later be responsible for massacring an entire village of civilians. His hands were shaking as he put the photograph back in the folder. I didn't know that at the time. I thought I was helping freedom fighters overthrow a communist regime. He pulled out a cassette tape and held it up to the light. This tape contains a conversation between Colonel Harrison and a man named Vincent Carrera, who was supposedly a CIA operative, but was actually working for a private arms dealer. They're discussing how to make it look like the weapons shipment was stolen by enemy forces, when in reality they were selling them to the highest bidder. The implications were staggering. How many of these operations were you involved in? Dozens, maybe hundreds. For 12 years I flew missions all over the world, carrying weapons, drugs, money, and sometimes people who needed to disappear. I told myself I was serving my country, but toward the end, I started to realize that some of these operations had nothing to do with national security. They were about money, power, control. Michael pulled out one more item from the briefcase, a small notebook filled with handwritten entries. This is my flight log. Every mission, every destination, every piece of cargo. Names, dates, locations, everything. He looked at me with eyes that held decades of guilt and regret. Jake, the information in this briefcase could bring down some of the most powerful people in the world. Politicians, military leaders, business executives, people who have built their careers on operations that violated every law and moral principle you can think of. I felt like I was suffocating. And they've been hunting you for 43 years because of this? Not hunting. Watching. Waiting. As long as I kept quiet, as long as I didn't try to expose what I knew, they were content to let me live out my days in obscurity. But something changed recently. Maybe someone else started asking questions, or maybe they just decided the risk was too great. He closed the briefcase and locked it again. Either way, the time for hiding is over. I sat there in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity, trying to process everything Michael had just shown me. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cab of my truck, the air felt thick with the weight of decades-old secrets and the very real possibility that we were both in mortal danger. Michael, I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper, why are you trusting me with this? You don't even know me. He smiled for the first time since I'd found him, a sad, weary smile that spoke of a man who'd carried an impossible burden for far too long. You know what I saw when you stopped to help me tonight, Jake? I saw a man who was willing to risk his own safety to save a complete stranger. In 43 years of running, of looking over my shoulder, of never knowing who I could trust, I've learned to read people pretty well. And you, son, you're one of the good ones. But what if I'm not? I asked, the question surprising even me. What if I decide this is too dangerous, too crazy? What if I just walk away? Then you walk away, he said simply. I won't try to stop you, and I won't blame you. This isn't your fight, Jake. You didn't ask for any of this. But I will tell you this. If you do walk away, if you pretend this conversation never happened, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been different if you'd had the courage to do the right thing. His words hit me like a physical blow, because deep down I knew he was right. I thought about all the times in my life when I'd taken the easy road, when I'd chosen safety over doing what was right. My divorce, when I'd walked away instead of fighting for my marriage. The time I'd seen another driver getting beaten up at a truck stop and had driven away instead of helping. All those moments when I'd chosen to be a bystander instead of standing up. All right, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. What do we do? Michael's eyes lit up with something I hadn't seen before. Hope. First, we get to that motel without being seen. Then we call Sarah Chen and arrange a meeting. But Jake, I need you to understand something. Once we make that call, once we start down this path, there's no going back. These people don't forgive and they don't forget. I started the truck and pulled out of the parking lot, heading toward the Desert Rose Inn. The storm was starting to let up slightly, but visibility was still terrible. Tell me about Sarah Chen. How do you know you can trust her? I've been feeding her information anonymously for years. Small pieces, nothing that could be traced back to me, but enough to help her expose some smaller corruption cases. She's never revealed a source, never backed down from a story, even when powerful people tried to intimidate her. Michael was watching the road behind us in the side mirror. 3 years ago, she published a story about arms dealing in the Middle East that came very close to exposing some of the operations I was involved in. That's when I knew she was the right person to trust with this. We pulled into the motel parking lot, a rundown place that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. Perfect for our purposes. The kind of place where the desk clerk wouldn't remember faces and the security cameras probably didn't work. How do we contact her without them tracing the call? Burner phone. There's a convenience store across the street that should have them. Michael was already reaching for the door handle. But first, we need to get a room and make sure we weren't followed. As we walked across the parking lot, Michael suddenly grabbed my arm and pulled me behind a parked car. "Don't look back," he whispered urgently. "But there's a black SUV that just pulled into the parking lot, no headlights." My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "Are you sure it's them? In this weather? In this location? At this time of night? It's not a coincidence." Michael's voice was calm, but I could see the fear in his eyes. "We need to get inside, now. But we can't go to the front desk. Too exposed." We made our way around to the back of the motel, staying low and using the parked cars for cover. Michael seemed to know exactly what he was doing, moving with the practiced stealth of someone who'd spent decades avoiding detection. "There," he said, pointing to a window on the ground floor. "Room 127. The lock's been broken for months. I stayed here 6 months ago. You've been here before?" "I've been everywhere before, Jake. When you're running for 43 years, you learn to have backup plans for your backup plans." He carefully pushed the window open and climbed inside, then helped me through. The room was small and musty, with 2 beds and a television that looked like it was from the 1980s. Michael immediately went to the window and peered through the curtains. "They're still out there. 3 men all wearing dark clothes. They're checking every room, showing something to the desk clerk." He turned to me and I could see the weight of all those years of running in his eyes. "Jake, I need you to listen to me very carefully. If they find us, if this goes bad, I want you to take the briefcase and run. Get it to Sarah Chen no matter what happens to me." "I'm not leaving you behind," I said, though my voice was shaking. "You might not have a choice." Michael sat down on one of the beds and opened the briefcase again. "But before that happens, there's something else I need to tell you. Something I haven't told anyone in 43 years. He pulled out a photograph I hadn't seen before. This one in color but faded with age. It showed a young woman with dark hair and kind eyes, holding a baby. "This is my daughter Rebecca and my granddaughter Emma. This picture was taken in 1979, just before I disappeared." I felt my throat tighten. "You had a family?" "I had to leave them behind to keep them safe. Rebecca was 22 when I disappeared. She probably thinks I'm dead. Probably tells her daughter that her grandfather was a coward who abandoned his family." Tears were starting to form in Michael's eyes. "But I couldn't risk staying. If they'd found me, they would have used Rebecca and Emma to get to me. So I made the hardest choice of my life. I chose to let my family think I was dead rather than put them in danger." The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside made us both freeze. Michael quickly closed the briefcase and motioned for me to be quiet. The footsteps stopped right outside our door, and we could hear voices speaking in low, urgent tones. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved on. "They're checking every room," Michael whispered. "It's only a matter of time before they find us." "You know what, folks?